Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Friday. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Katie Rowley. I will be the librarian host today. A few logistics before we start. This seminar is being recorded, so if you need to step away, if you want to share this with a colleague, any of those, you can find this on the library's YouTube channel after the fact. But since it is recorded, anything you put in, such as your name, email, and questions, will be shared with the panelists afterwards, so they can follow up if we don't get to your question. And with that said, if you do have a question, please put that in the question panel. We will be holding these until the end of the panel, and with time, we'll ask as many questions as possible. If you do have any technical issues with this platform, try logging off and back on into GoToWebinar. Just X out in that corner and then use the same link you were given in your registration email to log back in. That solves most issues. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Fiona Horsfall to introduce our session today.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our 5th Fireside Chat on transitions. As Katie mentioned, I'm Fiona Horsfall. I'm the Director of the Office of Research Transition Application, known as ORTA. And one of our roles is to provide transition support with the objective of accelerating transitions across NOAA and simplifying the transition process in general. Many of you are familiar with our website, where you can get more information on transitions and transition plans there. So the goal of this series of Fireside Chats is to provide participants with a broader understanding of the research and development transition process at NOAA. And today's Fireside Chat focuses on the NWS R2O Transition Plan review process. NWS remains as one of the key adopters of NOAA R&D outputs through the Office of Science and Technology Integration, OSTI, and through OSTI and NWS developed a robust process to review and approve transition plans to further connect R&D teams with NWS adopters. The panelists will discuss the value of this review, how to prepare for the transition plan review, and takeaway message on transition. Our moderator today will be Nicole Kurkowski. Nicole is the R2O team lead and in the Office of Science and Technology Integration, OSTI, as aforementioned, of NWS. She previously served as the NWS OSTI program lead for Facets, which she'll explain, Coastal Act program manager, the deputy HFIP program manager, NWS STI storm surge modeling program lead, and the NWS STI marine program lead. Ms. Kurkowski has previously led work and worked on as a scientific analyst at NASA, Goddard Space Flight Center, and as a meteorologist at NOAA's NSSL. So with that, I will now hand it over to Nicole.
Okay, thank you very much, Fiona. Good afternoon to all of you. As Fiona mentioned, I'm Nicole Kurkowski. As noted, I'm the lead of the R2O team in the National Weather Service's Office of Science and Technology Integration, or OSTI. And my office is responsible for the transitioning of promising innovations to operations within the Weather Service. And that's really the topic of our talk here today. So thank you for joining. I'm delighted to be with you. I'm delighted it's Friday and happy to be with our exciting panel. So I'll be your moderator this afternoon, and I'd like to introduce you to our panelists for today's Fireside Chat. First, we have Wendy Sellers. Wendy is the R2O Transition Manager and Program Lead for MRMS, the multi-radar, multi-sensor on the R2O team in OSTI. That is my group as well. In her role, Wendy manages and provides oversight of R2O projects, particularly in coordination of R2O project transition into operations with OAR, Weather Service headquarter portfolio offices, and the Weather Service regions and centers. Also from the Weather Service, we have Jim Nelson. Jim is the branch chief of the NOAA Weather Prediction Center, or WPC. Jim's staff maintains all operational production of products. His staff also improves and develops new techniques for forecast product production. One other aspect of the branch is the Hydrometeorological Testbed, or the HMT, as many of you are familiar with, which tests science and forecast techniques in addition to new numerical weather prediction output, and post-process products alongside forecasters, researchers, and developers. The entire branch is the R2O to R for rainfall, winter weather, and medium range forecasting for not only WPC, but for the entire Weather Service. I'd also like to introduce you to Matt Mahalik. Matt is the Research Transitions Lead for the Weather Program Office in OAR, also known as WPO. WPO finds, funds, and nurtures and transitions weather, water, and climate and social science research toward the Weather Service operations and other applications. Matt works to coordinate the planning and execution of transition of science from OAR to other line offices within NOAA and beyond. His background is in severe weather research and development, and particularly in weather radar and observations. We also have here on the panel, Steve Martinaitis. Steve is a research associate with the Cooperative Institute for Severe and High Impact Weather Research and Operations, also known as CIWRO, at NOAA NSSL. He is a part of a team of researchers that are focused on precipitation estimation and flash flood prediction. In his role, Steve works on and evaluates new products and techniques within MRMS and the flooded locations and simulated hydrographs, also known as FLASH. Those systems are designed to support Weather Service operations as well. So welcome to all of our panelists, and thank you. Our Fireside Chat today is focused on transitioning research to Weather Service operations. And as I noted earlier, I'm the lead of the R2O team in the Weather Service. Our office oversees most transitions from research to ops in the Weather Service. And an integral part of doing so really involves the development of a transition plan. And this is a plan that is developed between the project lead on the research side typically and the Weather Service office that receives that new tool or technology into operations. Sometimes we refer to those offices as the receiving office. Transition plans are an excellent way or opportunity for researchers and folks from the Weather Service to come to an agreement on what they will work on together. So for example, you might include in that plan the details of the project and what the output of the project investment would be. To decide upon common goals, in those plans we spell out detailed roles and responsibilities for all parties involved. And in these plans we really document the detailed milestones and deliverables along with any costs and activities required not only to do the development work, but also to document what's required to transition that work to operations from research. And then finally, we're trying to sort of evaluate or provide a rough order of magnitude of what are the costs to operationalize something? What is the operations and maintenance cost, or the O&M? So in these plans, we make note of all activities that must take place for the transition to occur. For example, do we need to coordinate with the AWIPS program office, or perhaps with NSEP central operations if we're upgrading a model or doing a model implementation. Transition plans are not contractual, but they are a way for researchers and the receiving entity to document how we'll work together toward a common goal. They are living documents, these transition plans, and they don't guarantee transition to operations. That decision lies within the Weather Service governance process, and it depends upon future funding appropriations. So now I really want to open up to our panel to talk about the Weather Service's transition plan review process. So Wendy, as our Weather Service R2O Transition Manager, I was wondering if you could maybe explain the Weather Service's R2O review process for our audience today.
Sure, thank you, Nicole. I'm happy to jump in here. So just for a little bit of background, the NWS Office of Science and Technology Integration, or OSTI, and the OAR Weather Program Office, or WPO, they've been working closely for the past several years to coordinate these transition plans for promising scientific and research opportunities. This coordination is required in NOAA Administrative Order 216-105B, which is the NOAA policy on research and development transitions. So the transition plan review process establishes an important collaboration, like Nicole said, between the principal investigator on a research project, OAR, and the Weather Service right within the first 6 months or so of a project's start. One of my roles is to ensure that each project is assigned a Weather Service point of contact, or POC, that acts as a representative of the receiving office for the research output. The POC and the PI work together to develop the transition plan for the project, which is then vetted by the receiving office directors and the WPO director. The NWS review process picks up after the receiving office directors have signed off on a draft transition plan. And it's required before the NWS line office transition manager, or the LOTM, signs off on the plan. So another one of my roles is to schedule and facilitate the NWS R2O Transition Plan review meetings that generally occur on a monthly basis, depending on whether plans and POCs are ready for the review. So there are two primary goals of this meeting. The first being to ensure that Weather Service Headquarters service delivery portfolios are aware of emerging R2O projects for their future planning purposes. And the second is to allow the portfolios an opportunity to provide feedback on the proposed transition path and identify any potential challenges that will need to be addressed. During the meeting, the NWS POC presents the transition plan, and Weather Service Headquarters portfolio representatives are each given an opportunity to ask questions and comment on the proposed path. If there are no changes recommended or only minor changes to the plan, then the plan will continue routing up through Weather Service and OAR leadership for their signatures. Each plan is eventually signed by Weather Service and OAR directors or their designees. And that's kind of a summary of the Weather Service review process.
Thank you, Wendy. So Matt, given your experience at OAR working with the Weather Service on transition plans, do you have any comments from an OAR perspective on the Weather Service transition plan review process?
Sure, yeah, thanks Nicole, and hi everyone. So I definitely say that it's made a huge difference, honestly, in the last few years from what we've seen just in bringing OAR and Weather Service, making that connection that maybe we've been lacking in years past. The process that's been developed over the last few years is really meant to ensure that the Weather Service has all the information that's needed in order to make some informed decisions, in order to make sure that that plan can move forward and eventually the transition can accelerate over into operations. So the information that is in the plan, and also the people who are involved in writing the plan and reviewing the plan, and then the people who are finally going to approve the plan to move forward, those are all really specifically and strategically selected to make sure that the R&D can move forward towards operations. I think in years past, there's been a lot of sort of wandering through the woods and lack of direction to getting R&D over towards operations. And really in the early days of WPO's facilitation of transition plans, we really struggled with managing the different roles and responsibilities. And I think this was reflected in some confusion and probably, if I'm being honest, some irritation among the PIs and upper management as well. And I think the introduction of these panel briefings that Wendy was describing have really turned the tide here to make sure that the Weather Service service delivery portfolio leads are able to identify ways to smooth out that path. They're also able to identify red flags early on, maybe even put some wheels in motion for future funding discussions. And I think they also allow leadership to feel comfortable that the proposed transition path is vetted and is something worth moving forward with. I'd say from the OAR perspective, it also allows our program managers to understand exactly who in operations is going to be evaluating those plans. And so I think overall, just working with Wendy's team and beyond in NWS, we've been able to standardize what makes sense to standardize. I think we've also tried to allow as much flexibility as possible where the plans need to be tailored to specific R&D outputs. And I think the overall hope here is that this really helps alleviate some of the burden that gets put on PIs. From having to learn all these different intricacies and make a plan for themselves. And this collaboration, bringing people together, it's made a difference from what we've seen.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate your comments and agree that I think it's improved relationships as well. So yeah, thank you. What advantage do you think this process brings by including multiple portfolios or divisions in the Weather Service to review transition plans? Perhaps Wendy could first address this as our liaison, or sorry, as our lead, but then I'd like to hear from those who have participated in the process as POCs and PIs. So Wendy?
Sure, thanks, Nicole. This will probably echo some of the things that Matt just said. This process supports more of a kind of no surprises approach for the Weather Service Headquarters service portfolios that kind of act as a catcher's mitt for research output. It's key for Weather Service leadership to plan and prioritize future resources and funding using this awareness of upcoming research deliverable. A proposed transition path can affect various service delivery portfolios in different ways, so like central processing versus dissemination. So it's important that these portfolios are aware of how they may be impacted if a research deliverable is considered for transition. So information such as, rough order of magnitude cost estimates for actually transitioning a new technology, or operations and maintenance costs for sustaining an application once it's implemented, these need to be taken into consideration and agreed upon by all impacted parties before a plan is signed.
Thank you, Wendy. Agree 100%. So Steve, as a PI that has gone through the process, what are your thoughts?
Thank you, and hello, everyone. I think the biggest thing that we gain from this is, we get to hear directly from the decision makers and what their thought processes are with all of this. I know that in the past that the researcher was kind of just limited to their own National Weather Service point of contact. And once you create that draft of the transition plan and send it off to the POC, you're kind of, out of the loop a little bit in the dark of what happens until you get that decision. And if your transition to operations is not approved or needs significant changes, you sometimes don't really understand why that occurred. But with this review process, you get to hear from everyone. You get to hear what all the decision makers within the National Weather Service are thinking, what their thought processes are with transitioning operations, and what the perceived path is to operations. So in the end, you get a better perspective of the entire process. The information loop is complete, and you really get a better understanding, and you know what to expect from our end.
Thank you, Steve. That's a really good perspective to have. So thank you for sharing that. Not often thinking that way, but it's good to see that we're improving the way things are run. Jim, as a NWS POC that has gone through the process quite a bit now, you have a lot of experience. What are your thoughts?
Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Yeah, I've been through this process quite a long time, and as Matt said, things have improved quite a bit. And as Steve has noted just recently, that having to know the process has helped out in the PI-POC relationship going forward. So being a receiving office, having this in front of other portfolio managers in the review process, and often too, it's not just once. So we do this, multiple times throughout the whole, transition and research process, so that we know where we're at, where the process is at, where we might have to pivot throughout this whole time frame as well. So having everyone around and understanding where the project's at, where the eventuality is expected, has always meant that, in this new paradigm that we're doing, has, made it a little bit better to get to the end, so that we find something, that we find the eventuality of the research that's being done and how it can help in the operational aspect of any entity it is the receiving office. So I think, having this and having it multiple times throughout the process actually has been an advantage to make sure that we make it to a successful end.
Thank you. Yes, many iterations, both good and bad. So Jim, for those who maybe haven't gone through the process, and since you've had some experience, what can somebody expect when they're preparing to go through the review process?
I think it starts early. Whenever you're talking to the proposed group that you want to do a proposal with and be a receiving office, it starts then even, so that you understand what may be the process of making that eventual transition. What does it take to get there? So, to be prepared is the conversation right from the get-go of even like, I want to propose this kind of work to work with you all. What does it take? And here's the science idea. Oh yeah, I love science. Everyone gets, hey, science. Science is fun. It's that extra part that we're trying to make sure that it's useful at the end, And that's why this review process helps get to that usefulness at the end, because we can all think of ideas and great things to do. However, we wanted to make sure that it makes it to somewhere that someone can use it. So, you know, being in that review process and being prepared for that review process starts from the beginning, and knowing what it takes to get there, what kind of stringence are you going to have as far as testing and making it to the next level, and making it to a appropriate place where everyone understands where it's coming from and where it will end. So you just want to make sure that throughout the whole process you're talking from beginning of proposal writing all the way till these transition review processes, so that we make sure that everyone's prepared and understanding what it takes to get there. So now, since we've all been through it a few years in this new kind of paradigm, I think we're getting better and better at that communication part from step one all the way to the end of getting prepared for transition. And as you said, Nicole, we're not guaranteeing that the PI gets their stuff transitioned, because we have other, factors at work as far as funding and O&M tails and in that regard. So that's where we stand, and I think just to be prepared is start from the beginning of the proposal process.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah, communication is certainly key, and I resonate with your comments on, this process is where the rubber meets the road. It's nice to have an idea, but to put that thing in motion, you really got to document things and build relationships. So thank you for saying that. Similarly, I guess, Steve, you've served as a PI, so what would you share as far as expectations for this process?
Yes, as someone who's outside of the National Weather Service, to build upon what Jim said about starting early and having, good communication and details throughout it. First, the important thing is to understand that as someone outside the Weather Service, you are assigned a National Weather Service representative. So someone represents the project for you with these meetings. And for us as researchers, the goal is to ensure that this NWS representative is familiar with your work, knows the details of the projects and how it would be incorporated into National Weather Service operations. So then when you get to the review process itself, for us, we understand that this is a good friendly atmosphere, talking with all the different portfolio managers and the different questions and discussions and dialogues that go in there about how best to consider a transition for a specific research objective. For a researcher, we mostly listen during this process. The NWS representative is there to speak for you, but they do ask direct questions, and that's the part where you get to help address any concerns that they might have.
Thank you for saying that. It's a really good comment, because when you're writing the transition plan and preparing for the meeting, you're really thinking through things deeply so that when you are at the review meetings, there really aren't any surprises. You've worked through various scenarios in preparation, and yeah, I think it's a really great collaboration. So thank you. And so, Wendy, I'd wonder if you have anything additional you might want to share regarding expectations for the process when you're preparing actually to go through the process.
Yeah, sure. So to kind of start from a high level, in general, it's best for the PIs and the POCs to see the transition plan as a living document. So researchers and Weather Service POCs should expect that the plan will evolve with the project and as they receive feedback from reviewers. Some of the guidance talks about how early in a project or transition plan will kind of be high level, but as the project evolves and everything, that the transition plan should kind of start to get more specific with it. So this may, provide some peace for the PIs and the POCs that they can continue to update the transition plan, but it can also, be a place where people might get nervous as well when they receive feedback and might need to make tweaks throughout the project life cycle. As far as the NWS review meeting itself, so this is kind of like the logistical piece. I typically connect with the PIs and the POCs about 3 weeks in advance of one of the monthly meetings. And I provide them a slide template for the briefing. And the briefing slides are essentially a distilled or like a Cliff Notes version of the transition plan. And so the POCs are the ones that are responsible for completing the slides and providing the briefings to those on the Weather Service review panel. But this is another good place where the PIs and the POCs can and should work together to ensure the content is good for the review.
Perfect. Yes, great advice. And Wendy certainly gets us all prepared and keeps us on track. Thank you. And I appreciate you reminding us that the transition plans are living documents. And there's kind of this saying I've heard, that's why we write these things in Word, or I should say Google Docs, and not in stone, because we do change things. Life is dynamic. So thank you. Now, I'm sure there's some people watching the Fireside Chat today who are wondering if this process is strictly between the Weather Service and OAR. And so I wanted to throw it to the panel. Matt, maybe you'd like to say something about this.
Sure, yeah, so the question is it a process that's strictly for OAR to Weather Service transitions? The answer is no. However, I will say that I think that the process that's been developed and implemented is more optimized for this type of transition. So, you know, the majority of the projects that have gone through the full Weather Service review panel that we've been talking about, I think have come from WPO, but that's really just because we were the ones that have kind of been working on it. So there's definitely no reason why other line offices can't get involved with this. And, you know, I'd say even within WPO, we are constantly reevaluating what works, what doesn't work. We have different types of projects that are always getting funded and are going to need to have some sort of transition path outlined. And, you know, those different types of projects are going to have different requirements to transition. So, you know, as an example, of technology that's being developed through the JTTI program will have different considerations in a lot of cases from knowledge that's being developed through a social science project, which will have different considerations from a code development project that comes from our EPIC program. And so, you know, we're constantly reevaluating things, and that just means that I think some of those considerations are open, you know, for other programs, other line offices that are looking to get involved too. And I'd say that even more recently, we've seen a lot more projects that are going through the process from other sources. So maybe some are coming from other OAR labs, some are coming from other line offices even. I know there have been some projects that have involved OMAO and NSSL, and that's really great to see, you know, especially since our current NOAA administrator is such a champion of transition plans. And it just takes a little bit of upfront work to understand what are the major requirements that our Weather Service partners will have for those projects. And so just some upfront work to hammer that out, understand what questions need to be asked in the transition plans, and then coming up with a strategy to actually make it a reality. So yeah, I mean, it's made a huge difference in the number of plans that have come from OAR to the Weather Service, I think, and I would argue even the effectiveness of the plans and the usefulness of the content in them. And I'd love to see that, you know, carry through to the other line offices as well. And I'd say, you know, I'll throw in a plug here too. You know, we have a new office that's in OAR called the Office of Research, Transition, and Applications, and they've been doing a lot of work to come up with a number of different resources for transition plan development. But even though it's an OAR office, you know, they're here to be a resource for everybody across NOAA. So definitely check out their website, see what they're developing, and hopefully they'll be of use across the board.
Thank you, Matt. Well said. Wendy, any thoughts on this that you'd like to add?
Sure. Just again, echoing, you know, Matt's sentiments. I think, you know, I've been in this role for about 6 months, and I'm really excited to be working with Matt because he's got some really good ideas about how we can, you know, look at expanding this process. Since I began in this role early in the year, like Matt said, I've been mainly working with OAR, mostly the Weather Program Office, but recently with some of the OAR labs. But there is room to expand, especially with the other line offices and internally within the NWS. If you generally just look at what the advantages are for transition plans and, you know, the way that it can facilitate, you know, these research outputs, getting in front of forecasters and show return on investment. I mean, there's really an advantage to looking at applying this process, you know, into other areas as well.
Thank you, Wendy. And I see that Whiskers has joined us as well. I'm trying to get her out of the shop, but you know what? In this telework world, you have to embrace the things that happen at home. So Whiskers, any thoughts on transition plans now? Okay, I think one final thought here to go through. What are some recommendations we'd make for others who are preparing for the R2O reviews? Matt, you might be able to share your thoughts on this, perhaps?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, I'll preface this by saying I haven't been a lead on an R&D project in probably close to 4 years now. So you start with that. But, you know, from what I've seen and, you know, hearing some of the comments from Steve and from Jim, I think it's pretty clear that one of the best things that you can do to prepare for an R2O review is just to keep that communication open early and often. If you're one of the R&D leads, it's so crucial to make sure that you're staying in contact with your weather service point of contact. If you're that POC over in the weather service, it's important to stay in contact with the R&D leads to make sure that, you know, everybody's on the same page, that path that's laid out in front of you towards transitioning, you know, stays clear. Just making sure that communication stays open. I'd say it's also really important to understand the types of information that the decision makers at weather service need to know. So it's really helpful to think from their perspective. So, you know, if you're planning to transition a numerical model, for instance, you're probably going to need to think about things like computational resources, the time and space for storage requirements, what sort of operational maintenance tails is going to be required after it transitions. And, you know, thinking about the time that it takes to actually move from, say, for example, an EMC code over into NCO operations. I know there are a lot of details, some would call them unpleasant details, but it's, you know, it's the down and dirty that really makes the transition work. And so I just say overall, you know, regardless of what type of thing is being transitioned, it's really important to pick out and lean on the experts who are really knowledgeable about adopting it, bringing it into operations, and what other applications can really play a role here. And so that's totally invaluable. Communication should never stop.
Indeed, thanks, Matt. Jim, I'm sure you might have some great advice to prepare for the reviews. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. And I like what Matt was saying there at the end. The communication obviously is big. One thing I thought about throughout this whole time was, you know, something we haven't really approached is, you know, we have a lot of people that have gone through this now over the last few years. We should pick apart some of the examples that we've had, you know, throughout other different parts. You know, we have the code handoff. How did that work? What were the hiccups? Let's try and learn from those going forward. What was the ideal one? Let's go back and see how that worked, and what would we miss? What would be better to make sure it was a lot smoother? Social science aspect, which is getting bigger and bigger and more, you know, funding behind it. We need to make sure that we have a nice code going forward as to what is that transition process for social science. So what our recommendations is, we have to go back and look at some examples, you know, and make sure that, you know, the PI and the POC look at those examples, even if it's not you from previous, you know, the past, you go back and look through other groups that were receiving office and different projects to make sure that you understand what were the hiccups going through the whole process, what were the successes, and let's try to recreate those. And that's where you start with that communication going back and forth. Like Wendy said at the beginning, no surprises, you know, and trying to eliminate those surprises along the way so that you are successful in getting to a point where you're both satisfied from the POC side as well as the PI side.
Well, we're ending on a good note there then, Jim. Thank you for that advice. I think it might be good now to pivot and take some questions from our participants. So Kate, maybe you could flag any questions that might have come in on the chat or comments. Anything we should address?
Sure. First thing, I think that Whiskers needs a shout out for how great she's been. But first question that did come in earlier was, how does the operations proving ground fit into this process of R2O?
I guess I could take a first cut at that. So I will say that there have been several projects that, you know, we might not see a clear path to operations right away, but we want to demonstrate the functionality in a test bed so that we can at least get ourselves to RL8. And so the OPG has been really instrumental in being dynamic and helping us work with things kind of in an agile way. They've really set up shop virtually through the pandemic. We can run things very easily now through AWIPS in the cloud. So one way in which we use the test bed is really to demonstrate things, and then potentially that might be a way to really accelerate things forward to operations. Like I said, the transition plans are not carved in stone; they are living documents. So let's say things go really well in the OPG, we can then go and append the transition plan with our updated path to operations. And that's just kind of one example, but they've been really instrumental in helping us really get to the finish line.
I'll just add on there, we've had, the test beds, being HMT, for hydromet, concerned about precipitation. I know we've worked with OPG as well in concert so that we could, advance some of these projects through transition plans. And I know SPC with the HWT has also partnered with OPG on occasion. So it's not a separate entity, it's part of the whole program. So OPG is definitely partnered with a couple other typical or known as the transition places, the HMT, HWT in the past. Now OPG is helping in that role.
Thank you, guys. Oh, Steve, go on. Stephen, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was saying the test beds are key from a research point of view, because I've utilized both the hazardous weather test bed and the hydromet test bed with our work, and getting that feedback from forecasters as products are demonstrated either in real time or in cases. The information that we gather both subjectively and objectively helps reinforce the work that the researcher is doing to help demonstrate to the Weather Service how the value it could be for operations, and then testing how it works within something like an AWIPS environment helps start guiding an easier path to how it could be transition operations.
Thanks so much, everyone. This is also a good time to mention that the next Fireside Chat will be focused on test beds and proving grounds. So tuck that away, and we'll be advertising that in a couple months here. So our next question is, based on the lessons here discussed, can we come up with a checklist or a quick guide on transitions? Or does one exist already?
I guess I'd ask for some clarifying information, like a checklist of what's included in a transition plan. We do have templates, and they can be changed. They don't have to, not one transition plan is like another, but I'm not sure, is the question for plans or through the process? We have materials that we can share with all of you going through the process through slides. We now have it up, I believe, on our R2O team website, so we're happy to share that with you. And Whiskers is not interested in the checklist.
I think that was the question was, yes, what are the desired steps of the process?
Okay, yes, we are happy to share that information out. Wendy often, I guess every quarter, she's giving at least one training session for the POCs and the PIs on the process. So yeah, happy to share that out.
Yeah, that's what I was going to jump in and mention, is that usually right after a project kicks off, there's what's called like a PI kickoff POC training session. And that gives like the funding program an opportunity to kind of speak directly to the PIs about what their expectations are throughout the project life cycle. So it's going to be kind of like the reporting requirements and everything. And then I jump in and kind of speak more to the POCs, our weather service folks, and talk to them about the roles and responsibilities of being a POC. So within this training, you get a little bit of everything. You kind of learn about the project life cycle for a certain program, and you learn about the transition plan development and review process. So I go into a lot more detail about the various sections of the transition plans and why they're there and what kind of information we're looking for and timelines. One of the things that I've thought about is maybe recording my POC training and making that kind of more widely available. So it would have to kind of be non-specific, because sometimes I have to change the information and the timelines according to the program. But that is something that I could think about doing, is just kind of a recorded webinar or something just on the POC training.
And I'll jump in real fast too. There's a couple, I would say a couple of other resources that are available online, publicly available. So one would be, I know that I'll plug ORTA again. I mean, they've been doing a lot of great work in sort of combining all this information, bringing it together into their website. So the ORTA website will have some of that information available. I know they are also leading a Tiger team of subject matter experts that are working on developing even additional materials that are probably even more widely applicable. For information more specific to Weather Program Office funded projects, our WPO website has some basic transition plan information there. And I would say in general, for more information about transition plans and what needs to go into them and who needs to review them and why they're getting approved the way that they are, just by probably going to Google and searching the NOAA administrative order, the NOAA policy on R&D policy, on R&D transitions, I would say, just there's going to be a lot of information there, the policy itself, and also the handbook on how to apply that. So there's some resources online too.
Great, thank you all. Our next question is, once a transition plan is developed, who owns that plan? Is it the program that develops it or the receiving office?
Matt, do you want me to take this, or you?
I'll let you start, I'll follow up.
Okay. Yeah, typically up until the point we go to the transition plan review meeting, the plan is kind of owned by the OAR or the research side. Once we go through the process, it's typically then owned by NWS. We share responsibilities in signing. There's a lengthy process in getting the plan signed, but I guess you could say that this process is kind of the point where we kind of switch ownership of the plans. Would you agree with that, Matt, Wendy?
Yeah, I would. I even maybe wouldn't even use the word ownership. Yeah. Because I mean, they really are jointly owned documents from start to finish. It really sort of falls on who takes the lead responsibility for completing certain steps. So in the early stages, most of the work on the project is the R&D itself. So the project is getting built up. The researchers, the PIs are understanding a little bit better what the path forward is and where the R&D outputs can be applied. And so that's where the onus really falls on the PI to work with some of the funding program managers and working through the research plan and picking out those operational applications. And then I would say probably over time, the Weather Service is probably getting integrated more and more to the point where this briefing, this panel review takes place. And then when time comes to make the actions actually happen, that's where I think the pendulum swings a little bit more over to the Weather Service responsibility in taking the outputs and actually integrating them into systems.
Thanks, Nicole. Thanks, Matt. Another question here. Many of these R2O projects deliver excellent science, but upon project close, the receiving office is not always supported to carry through the actual transition to operations. How can we address this so good science is supported all the way through implementation?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I'll note that there's a line office transition, LOTM, line off transition manager committee, the LOTMC, is looking at what we're calling stalled transitions. So we're looking into this more deeply. I know Matt and his group is looking at it, but it's not as simple as, well, my project, there was no attention on it, and that's why it didn't move forward. There's issues with, you may not have gotten funding for the project, or maybe there's some kind of upgrade that's required modeling wise that the timelines aren't lining up, or maybe it's not been approved through Weather Service governance. I mean, there are a lot of various reasons why things stall, but we know this is a problem, and we are going to be looking at it collectively as NOAA, not just Weather Service or OAR, but cross-line office. We know this is a big issue.
Thanks, Nicole. Does anyone else have any comments on that?
I can just jump in and say, you know, one of the things that we do talk about with the Weather Service POCs is kind of managing or monitoring the transition plan after a project ends. And so they can continue to stay in that role of communicating things like stalled transitions or you know, things like that to the researchers. So they continue on even after the project ends, monitoring the status of that transition plan. And the hope is that they maintain communication with the researchers to kind of keep them updated on what's going on, as well as, you know, the Weather Service portfolios.
Thank you so much for adding that, Wendy. Yes, indeed.
Thanks. I'm going to revisit that ownership question because there was a clarification. The thrust of that question was, who is responsible for revisiting the transition plan?
So I would say, like Wendy had mentioned, post transition plan review process, even post project funding runs out, no cost extension, I believe the Weather Service, we kind of keep track of the project and we keep the conversation going. So there is some accountability there that's required.
Right, and you know, the POC and the PI are still involved in that process. After, you know, as there's a no cost extension or, you know, trying to get to transition, you know, find out ways that it could be there, because I, you know, as Nicole said, stall transition. Well, there might be other, you know, ways that was intended originally might not be the final transition plan, and that at that point, then that's where you might find another solution. So you might not have made it that first stall transition, but you might find an alternative solution.
Nice.
Thank you. Our next question is regarding expanding the need for R2O reviews within the Weather Service. The number of transition plans are likely to balloon in the next couple of years, and they easily have 30 or more of these transition plans in progress at various labs. Do you have plans to scale up those reviews to meet the push from R&D?
Yes.
I'm looking at Matt because he's smiling because I know this has become a big conversation between the two of us. I like to joke that it's job security, but at the same time, I think that there's ways that we can look at efficiencies in reviewing these plans. Matt, if you wanted to expand on that.
Yeah, I think both in terms of how the plans are reviewed and also even the way that they're written and combined. We're looking at different ways of efficiencies of maybe combining transition plans for maybe multiple projects that contribute to a similar system. So, you know, if there are multiple code improvements that are going to be approving a single model, you know, could we potentially work across project lines to have sort of this quote unquote umbrella transition plan that can be reviewed and approved. And you know, we've seen some examples of how that could potentially work on different scales recently. So yeah, there are some ideas around for sure. There are definitely a lot of very headquarters-y, boring intricacies that we have to consider, you know, like what funding can actually cover in certain areas, and also the capacity and availability of the people who will be writing and reviewing the plans. So yes, I would say it's a well-known consideration and something that we'll be thinking about for a while. I was smiling because that question could have been written by me, because we've had that come up a few times.
Yes, the Weather Service, we work really closely with OAR, especially WPO, and we have all of their programs and their grant timelines sort of mapped out. Wendy does a great job sort of playing Tetris of getting all of the dates for when we expect these plans to come down the pike. And yes, there are quite a few coming down, but she does a great job making sure we have the plans that we need for each of our review meetings. And we do have support staff to help us take on additional load. But yes, this is, as Wendy and Matt were saying, a consideration of how to take on a massive amount of plans moving forward.
Thanks, Nicole. Our next question. outside of the Weather Service, does OAR, when utilizing this process to develop R2O, use a group of end users to set the research course, like a science board for academia, to approve or to provide recommendations or approve the goals of the projects?
I'll start. So in some cases, so I mean, obviously I can't speak for all of OAR, but at least within WPO, there are, it's really up to the individual funding programs, because, you know, again, just going back to the boring headquartersy things, there are certain restrictions on, you know, where certain funded projects can go and who can provide input on them. So, you know, if we're funding projects through grants and cooperative agreements, as opposed to contracts, you know, there's strict limits on what can actually be influenced by the federal government in terms of influencing the direction of the R&D. So there are definitely some limitations there, but I will say that a lot of the work that WPO puts in terms of ensuring that the R&D is relevant to operations, that's all the way up front at the call for proposals, and the proposals that are being requested are generally going to be narrowly focused on specific science priorities that are developed by end users, by operational folks, really across the weather enterprise. So that's the approach taken there, at least from WPO's side.
Thanks, Matt. Is there anyone else who has kind of thoughts on that? I know it's OAR focused, but.
Yeah, well, as someone who works on the OAR side and writes proposals, yeah, having all that information up front, as Matt said, is usually the key, and on us, the researcher, to put it in there to, you know, meet the needs of the call for the grant, the funding proposal, and to demonstrate right off the bat, you know, what the goal of the project is, the purpose, how it would serve to better the National Weather Service and the weather community, whether it be through, you know, updating an algorithm or showing how it could improve warning decisions, or you know, how it could improve the forecast capabilities of a model. That's a lot of that falls on us as the PI to kind of put that out there and let the Weather Service decide what to fund and how to keep moving that project forward.
Great, thank you, Stephen. I have one more question here. Where/how are user training aspects included in the transition process? Or is this something only after approved by the review committee for a full transition?
So I can jump in here if I understand the question. I think it was basically asking, like, how are like the training needs for a certain research output being assessed?
Yes.
And if that's the case, we have a representative from the Office of the Chief Learning Office on our panel review. So, you know, I usually share the transition plans with the attendees at least a week or two in advance, and they have time to go through the entire transition plan in detail, and then they sit in on that meeting. And so they get to ask questions and provide insights to the Weather Service POC that's presenting about training requirements and resources that are related to the transition path.
That's a good point, Wendy. Sometimes the projects include funding for the PI to actually do some of the training. So we have seen some projects that it's included and some where it's not. And like Wendy said, the rep from OCLO will come in and say, well, have you thought about this or that? And so that's a discussion we might have. But yeah, great question. Thanks, Wendy.
I mean, that also goes to what Stephen was saying about the test beds, because usually when you present your research in front of a test bed, you're presenting some kind of training aspect to it. So you have that that outlet right there as far as the training of the research entity and project that's coming to the test bed. So you have that initial training or initial setup or knowledge transfer, I guess, of the understanding of the research and how it can be applied in the test bed. So the eventuality of training, yes, relies on OCLO, or as Nicole said, sometimes there's actually some funding written into the proposal for the PI to work with the POC on training documents.
Thank you all. That is the end of the audience questions so far. So I think we have about 5 minutes. So Nicole, if you wanted to ask one last question, or we can transition into closing.
Sure. I think I just want to kind of ask Steve, you know, if you have any thoughts on the strengths and weaknesses of the process that you might want to share with those on the meeting here.
Yeah, of course. Having been through various iterations of this review process, the biggest strength is for you know, the researcher is aware of everything that goes on in the decision-making process. You know, when I first started doing this, I wasn't aware of all the different aspects of that transition to operations, you know, the need for space and bandwidth limitations, cost for transitions and personnel. Now I get to understand all those limitations and all the priorities that the National Weather Service had. One of the challenges that exist, and that was more towards the beginning of this whole process, was sometimes there might not be a full understanding from either side on the different parts of the project, whether, you know, the research and the goals, or from us on the research side, the limitations and requirements for operations. But as this has evolved over the years, a really good research operations transition plan, the documentation and having a knowledgeable NWS representative for you really helps with all that. And with both cases, you know, communication is key, and this review process allows for all that.
Thank you for saying that, Steve. Wendy, anything you might want to add here?
Sure. So from kind of a technical standpoint, well, I'll just say that with any process, there's a potential for it to slow things down. One of the logistical hurdles that we sometimes have, you know, working up at headquarters, is just the signature process itself can be a challenge. We are looking at using some more automated processes, kind of like a DocuSign, which may be an option in the future, but right now it's circulating a bunch of PDF documents with signatures. So there's, you know, a lot of version control and careful tracking. But, and this is where I kind of show that I'm a bit of a fan of processes. Well-documented and well-managed processes, they also create transparency. They can create transparency, enhance communication, and ensure that there's consistency in how things are done, like R2O transitions. So, you know, my goal for this process is to continue to improve on all of these aspects. If anybody that has known me in my past 19 years in the Weather Service, I'm really big on communication and collaboration. That's one of my favorite things. So that is, you know, one of my priorities when it comes to this process, is ensuring that we continue to grow in those areas. And as the liaison for R2O transitions for the Weather Service, you know, I'm happy to encourage everyone involved to feel comfortable reaching out to those of us in the OSTI R2O program to ask questions and provide insights. I also will add that, you know, because I stay connected to the Weather Service POCs, I know that being a POC is a lot of work, and that can be a challenge for those people that are involved in several projects at the same time. And I feel a little guilty when I start pinging them for the review meetings and everything. But what they're doing is very, very important. And so, you know, just a thank you to any POCs that are out there for the work that you do with us and with the principal investigators to really make this process work.
I'll echo that. A big thanks. Way to end it, Wendy. Thank you. So I want to thank our panelists today. Sincerely, thank you for lending your time and expertise. Thank you, Wendy and Jim, Steve and Matt. I really think we had an excellent discussion. I did enjoy the perspectives from the different angles of being the PI or the NWS POC, or working the process from headquarters. So thank you very much. I hope folks in the audience really learned something new today. And I'd like to also thank Kate for helping us out here, and Fiona. And a special thanks as well to Abby Arnold and Francis Choi for helping us organize this session. The next Fireside Chat will take place in the next 3 to 4 months, so please be on the lookout for that announcement. And I believe that is it. Kate?
Yep, that's it. If we didn't answer your question, we will send that on to the panelists and they will respond offline. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend ahead of you. Take care.
Thank you.